Change gears again. What, in your opinion, are the most effective strategies for building a more and just peaceful, start over again, for building a more just and peaceful world? And in your view, what are the most significant takeaways from Occupy, the Arab Spring, and the Ukrainian Euromaidan uprising?
Well, those are all quite different events, and I don't think you can consolidate them. Over time, there has, history doesn't just go in a straight line. There's progress, there's regression, and they're often in parallel. So say, take the last, say, 50, 60 years in the United States. There's been significant progress in developing a more peaceful and just and equitable society. Probably the most dramatic example is women's rights. Totally different from what it was 50 or 60 years ago. I mean, it may be kind of hard to remember, but if you look at U.S. history, at the time of the American Revolution, the women were not people. They were property. The United States took over British common law, and under British common law, a woman is the property of her father, and it's transferred to her husband. So, for example, one of the arguments against giving women votes was that it would be unfair to unmarried men, because a married man would have 2 votes, since obviously the property votes the way the owner votes. Well, that was U.S. law. If you look at the chipping away of this, it literally was not until 1975 that this principle was abandoned. In 1975, the Supreme Court ruled that women have the right to serve as peers in federal juries. Peer means a person just like you. Okay, that goes back to Magna Carta in the 13th century. Women were accepted as peers legally in 1975. That was part of a major change that's taken place in American culture since the 1960s, one of the main outgrowths of 60s activism. And there are plenty of other things like it. So opposition to, say, violent aggression is far above what it was 50 or 60 years ago. Take, say, Kennedy's invasion of South Vietnam. It's a phrase you've never heard, I suppose, because it isn't in consciousness. It has happened in the world, but it wasn't reported, and it isn't part of American history. In 1962, Kennedy sent the American Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam, authorized chemical warfare to destroy crops, so to drive the people out of the countryside, began big programs to concentrate people in what amounted to concentration camps to prevent them from supporting the guerrilla movement, which was overthrowing the U.S. installed government. That's an invasion. It happened, but not in our consciousness. The reason it's not in our consciousness is there was no opposition. It was reported, it was kind of known, like it wasn't a total secret, but nobody cared. You couldn't get people to talk about it. I mean, literally, I remember trying to give talks in the early 60s in people's living rooms. You couldn't get more people than that together. Well, that was the early 60s. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. It's the first time in the history of the imperial world that there have been massive protests prior to the invasion. Prior to the invasion, huge protests all over the world. Here too, my classes were called off because the students wanted to call them off to go down to the demonstration. That was 2003. Well, it didn't end the war, but it limited it. It's often believed that the demonstrations didn't do anything. That's a mistake. The United States could not begin to carry out the policies that Kennedy and Johnson could carry out without a second thought. It was bad enough, but it wasn't B-52 bombing of heavily populated urban centers. It wasn't chemical warfare to destroy crops. Many of the atrocities of the Vietnam War simply couldn't even be contemplated. Horrible enough, but not that. Okay, all of that is progress. there's also regression. There's been a big backlash from power centers against the civilizing effect of the 60s. Now, that's the neoliberal attack on the population, which has been going on for a generation. That's why, real wages, for male workers, real wages today are at the level of 1968. For the general public, real wages are about the level of 30 years ago. There's been stagnation or decline for the majority of the population. Tremendous concentration of wealth and tiny sector of the population, mostly a fraction of 1%, which feeds politics. Political power reflects economic power. The Supreme Court just yesterday just struck another blow against democracy and its committed effort to try to undermine the functioning of a democratic system by placing power in the hands of those who are super rich. Okay, that's what's going on. That's the McCutcheon case a couple days ago. Well, that's regression. And they're going on in parallel. That's the way history works. So what's the way to go forward? Well, as Martin Luther King put it, shift the arc of history by your own efforts and activism. That's the only way it's ever worked.